Richard the Lionheart, the warrior king who became a medieval legend, Part 1. The world that created Richard the Lionheart, the 12th century was an age of ambition, warfare, and dynasty building across Europe. Kings ruled vast territories that stretched across modern national borders, and power was measured not by lines on a map, but by the loyalty of vassals, the strength of castles, and the ability to raise armies. In this world, one family rose to dominate Western Europe with a collection of lands so extensive that historians would later call it an empire. This was the Angevin Empire, ruled by the Plantagenet dynasty, and at its height it controlled more of France than the French king himself. The foundations of this empire were laid by conquest and marriage. In 1066, Duke William of Normandy crossed the English Channel and defeated King Harold at the Battle of Hastings, establishing Norman rule over England. The Normans brought with them a system of feudal government, castle building, and military organization that would transform the English kingdom. Over the following decades, Norman barons consolidated their control, replacing the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy and binding England more closely to continental affairs. England was no longer an isolated island kingdom, but part of a wider Norman world that looked across the Channel to lands in France. The Angevin Empire took shape through a series of strategic marriages and inheritances. Henry II, who became King of England in 1154, inherited Normandy and Anjou from his father, and acquired the vast Duchy of Aquitaine through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Europe. This union brought together territories that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. Henry ruled not only England but also Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Aquitaine, and Poitou. His lands in France dwarfed those of King Louis VII, making the English king the most powerful ruler in Western Europe, and creating a rivalry that would shape the politics of the age. This rivalry between the English and French crowns defined the political landscape into which Richard was born. The King of France was technically the feudal overlord of the French territories held by the English king, but in practice, he lacked the military strength to enforce his authority. This created a constant source of tension. The French monarchy sought every opportunity to weaken English power on the continent, supporting rebellious vassals and exploiting family disputes within the Plantagenet dynasty. Meanwhile, the English kings worked to maintain and expand their French holdings, building castles, rewarding loyal vassals, and conducting military campaigns to enforce their authority. The result was a state of nearly constant conflict, punctuated by brief truces and fragile treaties. While European monarchs competed for territory and prestige, a different kind of conflict raged in the eastern Mediterranean. In 1095, Pope Urban II had called for a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule, launching what became known as the First Crusade. Against all expectations, the Crusaders succeeded, capturing Jerusalem in 1099 and establishing a series of Christian states along the coast of the Levant. These Crusader states, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa, survived for nearly a century through a combination of military skill, fortification, and divisions among their Muslim neighbors. The crusading movement transformed European society. Participation in a crusade was seen as the highest expression of Christian devotion, offering spiritual rewards and the promise of salvation. Kings, nobles, knights, and commoners took up the cross, traveling thousands of miles to fight in the Holy Land. The military orders, including the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, were established to defend the Crusader states and protect pilgrims. Crusading became intertwined with the ideals of chivalry and knighthood, shaping how medieval warriors understood their role in society. But by the middle of the 12th century, the Crusader states faced mounting pressure. Muslim forces, once divided, began to unite under powerful leaders. In 1144, the County of Edessa fell to the forces of Zengi, prompting the disastrous Second Crusade. Then, in 1171, a Kurdish military commander named Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub known in the West as Saladin, became the Sultan of Egypt. Brilliant, disciplined, and deeply committed to jihad, Saladin worked systematically to unite Muslim territories in Egypt and Syria under his rule. His ultimate goal was the recapture of Jerusalem. On July 4, 1187, Saladin achieved a devastating victory at the Battle of Hattin, destroying the main field army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and capturing King Guy of Lusignan along with many leading nobles. With the Christian military forces shattered, Saladin's army swept across the Holy Land. City after city surrendered or fell to siege. On October 2, 1187, after a brief siege, Jerusalem itself capitulated. For the first time in 88 years, the holiest city in Christendom was again under Muslim control. The news sent shockwaves across Europe and prompted immediate calls for a new crusade. It was into this world of dynastic rivalry, territorial ambition, and religious warfare that Richard was born, and it was this world that would shape every aspect of his extraordinary life. He inherited one of the most powerful kingdoms in medieval Europe, ruled territories that spanned 2 countries, and lived in an age when military prowess and crusading zeal were considered the highest virtues of kingship. The fall of Jerusalem would become the defining event of his reign, and his response to that crisis would make him a legend. Sources used: The Angevin Empire by John Gillingham, pages 738. Richard I by John Gillingham, pages 127. God's War. A New History of the Crusades by Christopher Tyerman, pages 106, 237–287. The Crusades by Thomas S. Bridge, pages 378, 312–347. The Oxford Illustrated History of the Crusades edited by Jonathan Riley Smith, pages 157 Part 2. The Making of a Warrior. Prince Richard was born on September 8, 1157, most likely at Beaumont Palace in Oxford, though some sources suggest he may have been born elsewhere in England. He was the 3rd surviving son of King Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, entering a family that was already marked by conflict, ambition, and an almost pathological inability to trust one another. His father was a restless, energetic king who ruled a vast empire and spent most of his life traveling between his territories, dispensing justice, putting down rebellions, and enforcing his authority. His mother was the former Queen of France, a patron of poets and troubadours, and one of the most formidable political figures of the age. Eleanor had previously been married to King Louis VII of France, but that marriage was annulled in 1152, partly due to their failure to produce a male heir and partly due to personal incompatibility. Within 2 months, she married Henry Plantagenet, who was 11 years her junior and not yet King of England. When Henry succeeded to the English throne in 1154, Eleanor became queen for the 2nd time, bringing with her the Duchy of Aquitaine, the largest and wealthiest region in France. Richard, as her 3rd son, would eventually inherit this duchy, and it was in the courts and castles of Aquitaine that he would spend most of his formative years. Unlike his older brothers, who were raised primarily in England and Normandy, Richard was brought up in his mother's domains in southern France. Aquitaine was culturally distinct from the northern territories of the Angevin Empire. Its language was Occitan rather than the long dial spoken in the north. Its courts patronized troubadours who sang of courtly love and chivalric virtue. Its nobles were proud, independent-minded, and resistant to outside control. Richard absorbed this culture deeply. He became fluent in Occitan and French, and while he would have understood some English, there is little evidence he ever used it. He became an accomplished poet himself, composing verses in the courtly tradition. But most importantly, he learned the art of war in a region where warfare was a constant reality. From an early age, Richard received the education expected of a prince destined to rule. He was trained in horsemanship, swordsmanship, and the use of the lance. He learned how to command men, how to conduct sieges, and how to fight in the heavy cavalry charges that dominated medieval warfare. He studied the principles of fortification and the strategic importance of castles in controlling territory. Unlike many medieval nobles who left the details of military planning to their commanders, Richard developed a personal mastery of the technical aspects of warfare that would later distinguish him on the battlefield. In 1168, when Richard was only 11 years old, he was formally invested as Duke of Aquitaine in a ceremony at Poitiers. This was more than a symbolic gesture. Aquitaine was notoriously difficult to govern, with powerful barons who resented outside interference and frequently rebelled against ducal authority. Henry II hoped that by installing Richard as duke and allowing him to be raised in the region, the Aquitanian nobles would accept Plantagenet rule more readily. The strategy had limited success. Throughout his teenage years, Richard was forced to campaign repeatedly against rebellious vassals, learning through experience how to besiege castles, negotiate with enemies, and wield both force and diplomacy to maintain control. These early campaigns shaped Richard's reputation as a warrior. He demonstrated a willingness to act with decisive brutality when necessary. When noble families resisted his authority, he besieged their castles, confiscated their lands, and in some cases ordered the execution of captured rebels. He showed a particular talent for siege warfare, understanding that control of fortified positions was the key to controlling territory in an age when pitched battles were relatively rare. He also proved capable of extraordinary physical endurance, leading his troops through difficult terrain and harsh conditions without complaint. Richard's relationship with his father and brothers was poisoned by the succession politics of the Plantagenet family. Henry II had multiple sons, and rather than waiting until his death to divide his lands, he attempted to assign territories to each of them during his lifetime. His eldest son, Henry the Young King, was crowned as co-ruler of England in 1170, a practice intended to ensure a smooth succession. Richard was designated Duke of Aquitaine. Geoffrey became Duke of Brittany through marriage. The youngest son, John, was initially left without a substantial inheritance, earning him the nickname Lackland. This arrangement created jealousy, resentment, and competing ambitions. In 1173, encouraged by their mother Eleanor and supported by King Louis VII of France, Henry the Young King, Richard, and Geoffrey rebelled against their father. The rebellion, known as the Revolt of 1173–1174, was a serious threat to Henry II's rule. Barons in England, Normandy, and Aquitaine rose in support of the young princes, hoping to gain advantages from a change in leadership. Simultaneously, the King of France invaded Normandy, and the King of Scotland attacked northern England. For a time, it seemed Henry II might lose everything, but Henry proved more capable than his enemies anticipated. He moved quickly between theaters of war, defeated the Scottish invasion, suppressed the rebellions in England and Normandy, and forced his sons to submit. Eleanor was captured and imprisoned, where she would remain for the next 16 years. The young princes were forgiven but humiliated, forced to acknowledge their father's authority and accept his terms. Richard, only 16 at the time, learned a harsh lesson about the costs of rebellion and the importance of military success. Despite this defeat, Richard continued to clash with his father over the following years. He resented interference in his governance of Aquitaine and chafed at his subordinate position. In 1183, Henry the Young King rebelled again, this time demanding that Richard surrender Aquitaine to him. Richard refused, and the two brothers went to war. The conflict ended abruptly when Henry the Young King died of dysentery in June 1183, leaving Richard as the eldest surviving son and heir to the English throne. Henry II then demanded that Richard transfer Aquitaine to his youngest brother John and accept Normandy instead. Richard refused. He had spent his entire life in Aquitaine, had fought to establish his authority there, and regarded the duchy as his birthright through his mother. The dispute festered for years, creating a permanent rift between father and son. Richard increasingly aligned himself with Philip II, who had become King of France in 1180. Philip was intelligent, calculating, and determined to break the power of the Angevin Empire, and he recognized that the discord within the Plantagenet family offered an opportunity. By the late 1180s, Richard had become one of the most feared military commanders in France. He had suppressed rebellions, captured castles, and demonstrated both tactical skill and ruthless determination. He was tall, physically imposing, and known for his red-gold hair. He had cultivated a reputation for personal bravery, often fighting at the front of his troops and exposing himself to danger in ways that alarmed his advisors. He had also developed a lifelong love of warfare, a quality that would define his kingship. When news arrived of the fall of Jerusalem in 1187, Richard immediately took the cross, vowing to join the crusade to reclaim the Holy Land. It was a decision that would change the course of his life and secure his place in history. Sources used: Richard I by John Gillingham, pages 2894. Richard Coeur de Lion by Jean Flory, pages 2389. The Reign of Richard Lionheart by Ralph V. Turner, pages 1554. The Angevin Empire by John Gillingham, pages 3978. Chronica by Roger of Howden, translated excerpts relating to Richard's youth and early campaigns. Part 3, Becoming King, and Preparing for the Third Crusade on July 6, 1189. King Henry II died at the Château de Chinon in the Loire Valley. He was 56 years old, exhausted by years of conflict, and broken by the final rebellion of his sons. In his last days, he learned that even his favored youngest son, John, had joined Richard and Philip II in their campaign against him. According to the chronicler Gerald of Wales, Henry's final words included a curse upon his sons. His body was taken to the nearby abbey of Fontevraud, where he was buried with little ceremony. Richard arrived shortly after his father's death. Some contemporary sources claim he stood silently by the body. Others report that blood flowed from the corpse's nose when Richard approached, a phenomenon interpreted by medieval observers as a sign of guilt. Richard moved quickly to secure his inheritance. On July 20, 1189, he was invested as Duke of Normandy at Rouen Cathedral. He then crossed to England, a kingdom he barely knew and had visited only briefly during his youth. On September 3, 1189, he was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey in a lavish ceremony attended by nobles from across the Angevin lands. The coronation was marred by violence when a delegation of Jewish leaders arrived bearing gifts, contrary to royal orders forbidding their attendance. Rumors spread that the king had ordered the killing of Jews, and riots broke out in London. The violence spread to other cities, including York, where more than 150 Jews died in a massacre at Clifford's Tower in March 1190. Richard was reportedly furious at the disorder, seeing it as a challenge to royal authority, and he ordered executions of some of the ringleaders. But his primary concern was not justice, but maintaining control and preparing for the crusade. Richard had no intention of remaining in England. His goal was to raise as much money as possible, as quickly as possible, to finance his participation in the Third Crusade. The contemporary chronicler Roger of Howden reports that Richard declared he would sell anything if he could find a buyer, reportedly saying he would sell London itself if he could find someone rich enough to purchase it. This statement, whether literal or rhetorical, captured the king's priorities. He sold royal offices, castles, lands, and privileges to anyone willing to pay. Sheriffdoms were auctioned to the highest bidders. Barons could purchase exemptions from joining the crusade. Even William Longchamp, a trusted administrator, reportedly paid £3,000 to become Chancellor of England and papal legate. Richard also imposed the Saladin tithe, a tax authorized by the church to fund the crusade. Every person in England was required to contribute a tenth of their income and movable property to the war effort. The tax was deeply unpopular but efficiently collected. Combined with the sale of offices and privileges, Richard raised an enormous sum, estimated by modern historians at perhaps £100,000, an extraordinary amount for the period. This financial mobilization demonstrated both Richard's administrative capacity and his single-minded focus on the crusade. Before departing, Richard needed to establish a government that could rule in his absence. He appointed his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, now in her late 60s and recently released from imprisonment, to act as regent with significant authority. He named William Longchamp as Chief Justiciar in England and made complex arrangements to balance power among various nobles and bishops. He also made a controversial decision regarding his brother John. Despite their recent conflicts, Richard granted John extensive lands and titles, including the counties of Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, Dorset, Nottingham, and Derby, along with control of key castles. He also arranged a marriage for John that brought additional estates. Some advisors warned that making John so powerful was dangerous, but Richard apparently hoped that generosity would ensure loyalty during his absence. Eleanor of Aquitaine reportedly advised Richard not to trust John completely, but Richard proceeded with the grants. Richard coordinated his departure with King Philip II of France, with whom he had campaigned against Henry II, but whose relationship was now shifting from alliance to rivalry. The two kings agreed to travel to the Holy Land together, sharing resources and responsibilities. This alliance was both practical and political. Crusading together reduced the risk that one king would attack the other's territories while he was away, and it allowed them to present a united Christian front. However, the agreement also contained the seeds of future conflict, as both men were proud, ambitious, and deeply suspicious of each other's motives. On July 4, 1190, Richard and Philip met at Vézelay in Burgundy, where their combined armies assembled before beginning the journey south. Richard's forces numbered several thousand knights and many more infantry, along with support personnel, supplies, and equipment. The logistical challenge of moving such a force across Europe and then to the Holy Land was immense. The two kings decided to travel by sea rather than overland through hostile Byzantine territory, which had proven disastrous for earlier crusades. They arranged for fleets to carry their armies from various Mediterranean ports. Richard and Philip traveled together through France and into Italy, but at Lyon they separated. Philip continued to Genoa to embark on ships provided by that city, while Richard traveled to Marseille where his own fleet was supposed to meet him. When the fleet was delayed, Richard continued along the coast, eventually hearing ships and sailing to Sicily, where he arrived in September 1190. Sicily was strategically important as a stopping point, but it also presented political complications. The Kingdom of Sicily was ruled by Tancred of Lex, who had recently seized the throne following a disputed succession. Richard's sister Joan had been married to the previous king, William II, and following William's death, Tancred had imprisoned her and confiscated her dowry. Richard, ever protective of his family's interests and rights, demanded Joan's release and the return of her property. When Tancred hesitated, Richard seized the city of Messina in a brief but efficient military operation. The display of force convinced Tancred to negotiate. Joan was released, a financial settlement was reached, and Richard established his army in winter quarters. During the winter of 1190–1191, tensions between Richard's troops and the local population led to frequent clashes. There were also growing strains between Richard and Philip, partly due to personal friction and partly due to political maneuvering. Philip had expected Richard to marry his sister, Alice, to whom Richard had been betrothed for years, but Richard refused, claiming that Alice had been his father's mistress. Instead, Richard announced his intention to marry Berengaria of Navarre, the daughter of King Sancho VI of Navarre. This marriage offered political and strategic advantages, including securing the southern borders of Aquitaine, but it humiliated Philip and further damaged their relationship. In March 1191, Philip departed Sicily for the Holy Land, unwilling to wait longer. Richard followed in April, but not before making a decision that would have significant consequences. Rather than sailing directly to the Holy Land, Richard diverted his fleet to Cyprus, an island controlled by Isaac Komnenos, a Byzantine prince who had declared himself independent emperor. Richard's justification for this detour was that some of his ships, including one carrying his sister Joan and his bride-to-be Berengaria, had been wrecked on Cyprus, and Isaac had imprisoned the survivors and looted the ships. But Richard also recognized the strategic value of Cyprus as a supply base and staging area for crusading operations. The conquest of Cyprus took less than a month. Richard landed with his army, defeated Isaac's forces in several engagements, and systematically captured the island's fortifications. Isaac attempted to negotiate but ultimately surrendered unconditionally. Richard sold the island to the Knights Templar and later to Guy of Lusignan, the former king of Jerusalem, but the immediate benefit was the wealth seized from Isaac's treasury and the establishment of a secure base in the eastern Mediterranean. While in Cyprus, Richard married Berengaria in a ceremony at Limassol on May 12, 1191. She was crowned Queen of England, though she would never actually visit the kingdom. By the time Richard finally arrived at the siege of Acre in early June 1191, the Crusader army had been besieging the city for nearly 2 years. King Philip had arrived a few weeks earlier, but the siege had stalemated. The Crusaders surrounded Acre, but Saladin's army surrounded the Crusaders, creating a double siege. Disease, starvation, and constant skirmishing had devastated both sides. Morale was low. Leadership was divided. The arrival of Richard and his army, along with the massive supplies and siege equipment he brought from Cyprus, transformed the situation. The Third Crusade was about to enter its decisive phase, and Richard was about to face the opponent who would define his legend. Sources used: Richard I by John Gillingham, pages 95–163, The Reign of Richard Lionheart by Ralph V. Turner, pages 55–102, The Crusades by Thomas Bridge, pages 348–389, God's War. A New History of the Crusades by Christopher Tyerman, pages 288–362, Chronica by Roger of Howden, translated excerpts relating to Richard's accession and journey to the Holy Land Itinerarium Peregrinorum, et Gesta Regis Ricardi, translated excerpts relating to the journey to the Crusade Part 4. Richard versus Saladin. When Richard arrived at Acre on June 8, 1191, he found a Crusader army exhausted by months of siege warfare but desperate for leadership and hope. The city of Acre, strategically vital as a port on the Palestinian coast, had been under siege since August 1189. The Crusader forces were trapped between the city walls and Saladin's army, which had established positions in the hills surrounding the siege lines. Attempts to storm the walls had failed repeatedly. Siege towers had been burned. Mines had been countermined. Disease had swept through the camps, killing thousands. King Philip II of France had been present since April, but his efforts to coordinate the siege had produced limited results. Richard brought not only fresh troops but also specialized siege equipment, including massive stone-throwing engines called mangonels and trebuchets, along with experienced engineers who understood how to deploy them effectively. He also brought energy, determination, and a willingness to personally supervise the technical details of siege operations. Despite falling seriously ill shortly after his arrival, likely with scurvy or another disease common in the Crusader camps, Richard directed the siege from his sickbed. The sources describe him being carried on a litter to observe the walls and issuing orders for the placement of artillery and the timing of assaults. The intensity of the bombardment increased dramatically. Richard's siege engines pounded the walls day and night, opening breaches that the defenders struggled to repair. Miners worked to undermine the foundations of key towers. Assault parties probed for weaknesses. Inside the city, the garrison was running out of food, water, and hope. Saladin attempted several relief efforts, launching attacks against the Crusader siege lines to create opportunities for supplies to reach the city, but Richard and Philip's forces held firm. By early July, the situation inside Acre had become desperate. On July 12, 1191, the garrison of Acre surrendered. The terms were negotiated with both Richard and Philip, and they were detailed. The defenders would yield the city and its contents. The garrison, numbering nearly 3,000 men, would be held as prisoners. Saladin would be required to pay a ransom of 200,000 gold dinars, release 1,600 Christian prisoners, and return the relic of the True Cross, which had been captured at the Battle of Hattin. If these terms were met within a specified timeframe, the garrison would be released. If not, they would be executed. The fall of Acre was a tremendous victory for the Crusaders, providing them with a secure base, a functioning port, and an enormous psychological boost. But it also exposed the tensions within the Crusader leadership. Richard and Philip quarreled over the division of spoils and the political future of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Philip supported Conrad of Montferrat as the rightful king, while Richard backed Guy of Lusignan, the deposed king whom he had supported and to whom he had sold Cyprus. The dispute became bitter and personal, reflecting the deeper rivalry between the French and English monarchs. In late July, Philip announced his intention to return to France. He claimed illness, and indeed he had been sick during the siege, but most observers believed the real reasons were his frustration with Richard's dominance, his desire to advance French interests back home, and his resentment at being overshadowed by the English king. Philip left a portion of his army under the command of Hugh, Duke of Burgundy, and sailed from Acre on July 31, 1191. His departure left Richard as the unchallenged leader of the Third Crusade, a position that brought both opportunity and enormous responsibility. Richard now faced a difficult decision about the prisoners from Acre. Saladin had failed to meet the deadline for delivering the ransom, the Christian prisoners, and the True Cross. Negotiations continued, but Richard grew impatient. He also faced practical problems. Feeding and guarding 3,000 prisoners strained his resources. Keeping them captive while he advanced south toward Jerusalem risked leaving a hostile force behind his lines. On August 20, 1191, Richard made a decision that would stain his reputation for centuries. He ordered the execution of the prisoners. According to the Muslim chronicler Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, who was present with Saladin's army, the prisoners were marched out of the city and massacred in full view of Saladin's forces, who were too distant to intervene. The massacre at Acre was condemned by Muslim sources and caused unease even among some Christian chroniclers. Modern historians have debated Richard's motives. Some argue it was a calculated military decision, eliminating a potential threat and punishing Saladin for failing to honor the terms of surrender. Others suggest it was an act of frustration and cruelty. John Gillingham and other scholars have pointed out that such massacres, while shocking to modern sensibilities, were not uncommon in medieval warfare when terms of surrender were believed to have been violated. The question remains whether Richard genuinely believed Saladin was negotiating in bad faith, or whether he used the delay as a pretext for an execution he had already planned for strategic reasons. What is certain is that the massacre hardened Muslim resistance and deepened the conflict. With Acre secured, Richard began the march south along the coast toward Jaffa, from where he intended to advance on Jerusalem. The Crusader army moved in a carefully organized formation, with the baggage train and infantry protected on the landward side by ranks of armored knights. Saladin's forces shadowed them constantly, launching hit-and-run attacks designed to provoke the Crusaders into breaking formation and pursuing, which would allow the Muslim cavalry to isolate and destroy scattered units. Richard maintained strict discipline, forbidding his knights from charging without orders and ensuring the army advanced as a cohesive force. On September 7, 1191, Saladin decided to force a decisive engagement near the town of Arsuf. His army, numbering perhaps 20,000 men, attacked the Crusader column with waves of mounted archers and cavalry charges. The Crusader infantry, protected by padded armor and large shields, absorbed the assault while the knights held position despite suffering casualties and intense psychological pressure. The Muslim attacks intensified, targeting the rearguard commanded by the Hospitaller Knights, who sent repeated messages to Richard begging for permission to charge. Richard waited, understanding that timing was critical. He needed the Muslim forces to commit fully and to come close enough that a charge would be decisive rather than allowing them to retreat and regroup. The Hospitallers, unable to endure further without responding, finally charged without orders. Seeing the line beginning to break, Richard immediately ordered a general advance, leading the charge himself. The result was devastating. The Crusader heavy cavalry smashed into the Muslim lines, breaking their formation and sending them into retreat. Saladin's army withdrew in disorder, suffering significant casualties. The Battle of Arsuf was not strategically decisive in the sense of destroying Saladin's army or ending the war, but it was a major tactical victory. It demonstrated Richard's skill as a battlefield commander, his ability to maintain discipline under pressure, and the superiority of Crusader heavy cavalry when properly deployed. The victory also enhanced Richard's reputation throughout the Christian and Muslim worlds. The sources from both sides acknowledge his leadership, and later chroniclers would elevate Arsuf into one of the great battles of the Crusades. Following the victory, Richard captured Jaffa and refortified it as a base for the advance on Jerusalem. But the march toward the Holy City proved far more difficult than anticipated. Saladin had adopted a strategy of scorched earth, destroying wells, fortifications, and supplies along the route to deny resources to the Crusaders. The weather turned harsh, with heavy rains turning roads into mud. The Crusader army advanced to within 12 miles of Jerusalem in December 1191, and again in June 1192, but each time Richard made the agonizing decision to withdraw. The reasons for not attacking Jerusalem have been debated by historians. The most practical issue was logistics. Jerusalem was inland, far from the coast and the Crusader supply lines. Even if the Crusaders managed to capture the city through siege, holding it would be nearly impossible without controlling the surrounding countryside, which was firmly in Muslim hands. Richard's military advisors, including the Templar and Hospitaller masters, warned that a siege would stretch resources to breaking point and risked a catastrophic defeat if Saladin counterattacked. Richard also faced political pressures, with some Crusader factions doubting whether the enterprise was feasible and others eager to return home. While avoiding a direct assault on Jerusalem, Richard conducted a series of raids and campaigns to strengthen the Crusader position along the coast and to pressure Saladin into negotiations. He fortified Ascalon, a strategically important city that Saladin had demolished. He led lightning raids into the interior, capturing supply caravans and forcing Saladin to keep his army concentrated. In July 1792, when Saladin launched a surprise attack on Jaffa and captured the city, Richard responded with remarkable speed. He sailed from Acre with a small force, arrived before the citadel fell, and led an amphibious assault that retook the city. A few days later, Saladin attacked Richard's camp outside Jaffa at dawn. According to both Christian and Muslim sources, Richard fought with extraordinary personal bravery, rallying his outnumbered forces and repelling the attack. Throughout the campaign, Richard and Saladin never met face to face, but they engaged in extensive negotiations through intermediaries, particularly through Richard's envoys and Saladin's brother, Al-Adil. The negotiations were complex and at times bizarre. Richard at one point proposed that his sister Joan marry Al-Adil and that they jointly rule Jerusalem, a suggestion that both Joan and the Muslim leadership rejected. Despite the continuing warfare, both leaders developed a degree of mutual respect. Muslim sources describe Saladin's admiration for Richard's courage and military skill, while Christian sources note Richard's acknowledgement of Saladin's honor and chivalry. By the summer of 1192, both sides were exhausted. Richard faced political crises at home, where his brother John was conspiring with Philip II to seize power. Saladin's position was also weakening, with internal divisions among his emirs and the strain of maintaining a large army in the field for years. Negotiations intensified, and on September 2, 1192, Richard and Saladin agreed to the Treaty of Jaffa, Under its terms, the Crusaders retained control of the coastal cities from Tyre to Jaffa. Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands, but Christian pilgrims would be guaranteed safe passage to visit the holy sites. The treaty was set to last 3 years and 8 months. Richard never entered Jerusalem. According to later legend, when he came within sight of the city during one of his advances, he covered his eyes with his shield, saying he would not look upon the city he could not liberate. This story, while dramatic, does not appear in contemporary sources and is likely a later embellishment. What is documented is Richard's frustration and his pragmatic acceptance that the military situation did not allow for the recapture of the Holy City. On October 9, 1192, Richard departed the Holy Land, sailing from Acre. He left behind a Crusader presence that was stronger than it had been 3 years earlier, with secure ports, rebuilt fortifications, and a treaty that ensured the survival of the Kingdom of Jerusalem for another century. But he had not achieved the goal for which the Crusade had been called. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, and the dream of restoring complete Christian control of the Holy Land remained unfulfilled. The campaign established Richard's reputation as one of the great military commanders of the medieval period. His tactical skill, personal courage, and ability to inspire troops became legendary. Saladin, for his part, maintained control of Jerusalem and earned a reputation for chivalry and mercy that would make him a respected figure even in Christian chronicles. The two men, who shaped each other's legacies, became the central figures in the romanticized memory of the Crusades. Their conflict elevated into a clash of noble warriors fighting with honor on opposite sides of a holy war. The reality was more complex, more brutal, and less chivalrous than the legends suggest, but their military achievements were real, and their confrontation at Acre, Arsuf, and Jaffa became the defining moments of the Third Crusade. Sources used: Richard I by John Gillingham, pages 164–237, The Crusades by Thomas S. Bridge, pages 390–450, 8 God's War. A New History of the Crusades by Christopher Tyerman, pages 363–429, The Crusades Through Arab Eyes by Amin Malouf, pages 196–227, Itinerarium Peregrinorum et Gesta Regis Riccardi, translated excerpts relating to the Siege of Acre, Battle of Arsuf, and negotiations with Saladin Estuar de la Guerra, Saint by Ambroise, translated excerpts relating to the Crusade campaigns Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad. The Rare and Excellent History of Saladin, translated excerpts relating to Richard's campaigns Part 5. Captivity, Return, and Final Campaigns. Richard's journey home from the Holy Land became one of the most dramatic episodes of his life. Rather than returning by the safe route through Italy and France, Richard chose to sail through the Adriatic, possibly hoping to travel more quickly or perhaps to avoid territories controlled by his enemy, King Philip II. In late October 1192, Richard's ship was wrecked near Aquileia, at the northern end of the Adriatic Sea. Finding himself in hostile territory, Richard attempted to travel overland in disguise through the lands of Duke Leopold V of Austria, with whom he had quarreled bitterly during the Crusade over the division of spoils at Acre. The details of Richard's capture are reported with variations in different chronicles, some of which contain legendary embellishments. According to William of Newburgh and Roger of Howden, Richard traveled with a small group of companions, attempting to pass as pilgrims or merchants. Near Vienna, in December 1192, Richard was recognized and arrested by men loyal to Duke Leopold. Some later sources claim he was discovered in a tavern or identified by his extravagant spending, but contemporary accounts provide few specific details. What is certain is that Leopold seized Richard and held him prisoner, a shocking violation of the protections traditionally afforded to Crusaders returning from the Holy Land. Duke Leopold soon handed Richard over to Emperor Henry VI of the Holy Roman Empire, who had his own grievances against the English king. Henry was related to the Hohenstaufen dynasty and supported Tancred of Lex's enemies in Sicily, whom Richard had antagonized during his stay there. More importantly, Henry saw an opportunity to extract an enormous ransom and to gain leverage over European politics. Richard was imprisoned in various castles in Germany and Austria while negotiations over his release began. The news of Richard's capture reached England in early 1193 and caused immediate political crisis. His brother John, who had been maneuvering for power during Richard's absence, saw an opportunity to seize the throne. John traveled to Paris and met with King Philip II, who had already been working to undermine Richard's position. Philip had invaded Normandy shortly after returning from the Crusade, violating his Crusader oath and the truce that was supposed to protect the lands of absent Crusaders. Now, with Richard imprisoned, Philip and John formed an alliance. Philip offered to support John's claim to the English throne in exchange for territorial concessions in France. Eleanor of Aquitaine, now in her 70s, acted decisively to protect her son's interests. She rallied support among the English barons, fortified key castles, and ensured that Richard's officials maintained control of the kingdom. She also opened negotiations with Emperor Henry VI for Richard's release. The emperor's demands were staggering. He required a ransom of 150,000 marks, an almost inconceivable sum equivalent to roughly 2 to 3 times the annual revenue of the English crown. The ransom was set at roughly 100,000 pounds of silver, making it one of the largest ransoms in medieval history. Raising this sum required extraordinary measures. A tax of 25% was levied on income and movable property across England. The church was required to contribute gold and silver plate. Monastic houses surrendered their wealth. The Cistercian order, which had been exempted from taxation, was required to donate a year's wool production. Every knight in England was assessed, and those who could not pay in cash contributed goods or service. The collection effort was remarkably efficient, demonstrating the administrative capacity of the Angevin government, and by early 1194, a substantial portion of the ransom had been gathered. While imprisoned, Richard was brought before the imperial diet at Speyer in March 1193, where he was formally accused of various offenses, including the betrayal of the Holy Land, the insult to Duke Leopold at Acre, and the murder of Conrad of Montferrat, who had been assassinated in the Holy Land in 1192. Richard defended himself vigorously, and according to Roger of Howden, his eloquence and bearing impressed even his accusers. The charges were eventually dropped or set aside, but the ransom demand remained. King Philip and Prince John attempted to prevent Richard's release by offering Emperor Henry substantial sums to keep Richard imprisoned or to hand him over to them. According to Ralph of Daistow, Philip sent a message to John warning him that the devil is loose when he learned Richard was about to be released. John fortified his castles in England and prepared for civil war. But Eleanor and Richard's loyal supporters maintained control of most of the kingdom, and the ransom continued to be collected. Richard was finally released on February 4, 1194, after more than a year in captivity. He had to swear homage to Emperor Henry and agree to additional payments beyond the initial ransom, including a promise of further gold and military support. The terms were humiliating, but Richard accepted them to secure his freedom. He immediately returned to England, landing at Sandwich in March 1194. He had spent less than 6 months in England during his entire reign, and his absence had lasted nearly 5 years. Richard moved quickly to restore order. He marched north to confront his brother John, who abandoned his rebellion and fled to France. Richard's forces besieged and captured the castles John had fortified. John eventually submitted, and Richard, in a gesture that surprised many contemporaries, forgave him, reportedly saying, "You are only a child who has been led astray by evil counselors." John was 27 years old at the time. The statement reveals either Richard's affection for his youngest brother, his political calculation that keeping John loyal was preferable to creating a permanent enemy, or possibly his contempt for John's abilities. With England secured, Richard turned his attention to France. King Philip had used Richard's absence to seize substantial territories in Normandy, capturing key fortresses and making alliances with Norman barons. Richard spent the final 5 years of his life campaigning almost continuously to recover these losses and to defend his French domains. This period saw some of Richard's most impressive military achievements, though they are far less famous than his crusading exploits. Richard proved himself a master of medieval warfare. He understood that in an age when siege warfare dominated and pitched battles were rare, control of fortified positions was paramount. He conducted rapid campaigns, moving his forces quickly to respond to threats and to exploit opportunities. He built, rebuilt, and captured dozens of castles. He negotiated temporary alliances, switched sides when advantageous, and used both military force and diplomatic pressure to weaken Philip's position. The centerpiece of Richard's defensive strategy was the construction of Château Gaillard, a massive fortress built on a cliff overlooking the Seine River in Normandy. Construction began in 1196 and was completed with remarkable speed, possibly within 2 years. Richard personally supervised the design, incorporating the latest developments in military architecture. The castle featured concentric defenses, a heavily fortified keep, an innovative use of machicolations and cylindrical towers that reduced blind spots, and a location that allowed it to dominate river traffic and control access to Rouen. Richard reportedly called it his saucy castle, expressing pride in its strength. The construction was enormously expensive, but Richard saw it as essential to defending Normandy against French invasion. Richard's campaigns against Philip were marked by constant maneuvering. In 1194, Richard defeated Philip at the Battle of Freydeval, a rare open battle in which Richard's forces routed the French army and captured Philip's baggage train, including the royal seal and financial records. In 1198, Richard formed an alliance with Baldwin I of Flanders and other northern lords, creating a coalition that threatened Philip from multiple directions. Richard also used his wealth to hire mercenaries, including large numbers of Brabants and Routiers, professional soldiers whose effectiveness on the battlefield offset their brutal reputation. The war was not a series of glorious battles, but a grinding struggle of sieges, raids, and skirmishes. Philip was a cautious, methodical commander who avoided direct confrontation with Richard whenever possible, preferring to gain ground through diplomacy and exploitation of Richard's absences. Richard was aggressive and often reckless, personally leading assaults and exposing himself to danger. The two kings negotiated multiple truces, none of which lasted long. Each used propaganda, bribery, and alliances to weaken the other. The conflict drained the resources of both kingdoms and caused enormous suffering among the populations of the contested regions. Despite the intensity of the fighting, Richard was clearly winning by the late 1190s. He had recovered most of the territories Philip had taken during his captivity and was advancing into French-controlled lands. Château Gaillard anchored a defensive system that made further French gains in Normandy extremely difficult. Philip, facing pressure from multiple fronts and running short of funds, was increasingly on the defensive. Had Richard lived another decade, he might have decisively broken French power and secured the Angevin Empire for another generation. But Richard's time was running out. Throughout these years, Richard spent almost no time in England. He visited the kingdom briefly in 1194 to restore order and secure additional funds, but he returned to France within a few months and never came back. England was, for Richard, primarily a source of revenue to fund his wars in France. He appointed competent administrators, most notably Hubert Walter, who served as Archbishop of Canterbury and Justiciar, to govern in his absence. These officials maintained order, collected taxes, and ensured that English resources flowed to Richard's campaigns. But Richard himself remained focused on his French domains, particularly Normandy and Aquitaine, which he regarded as his true patrimony. Richard's absences and his constant demands for money created resentment in England. The chronicler William of Newburgh, writing shortly after Richard's death, noted that the king extracted enormous wealth from the kingdom, but gave little in return. The costs of the Crusade, the ransom, and the wars in France had drained England's wealth. Yet Richard remained personally popular among segments of the population, particularly among those who valued his military reputation and saw him as a heroic Crusader king. This contradiction between Richard's actual governance and his legendary reputation would persist long after his death. By early 1199, Richard appeared to be at the height of his power. He had defeated Philip's invasions, secured his French territories, and built an impressive network of fortifications. He had survived captivity, betrayal, and years of warfare. He was 41 years old, physically strong, and apparently in good health. But medieval life was unpredictable, and an event of seemingly minor importance was about to cut short one of the most remarkable careers in medieval history. Sources used: Richard I by John Gillingham, pages 238–312. The Reign of Richard Lionheart by Ralph V. Turner, pages 103–187. The Angevin Empire by John Gillingham, pages 79–121. Chronica by Roger of Howden. Translated excerpts relating to Richard's captivity and release Historia Rerum Anglicarum by William of Newburgh. Translated excerpts relating to Richard's reign and wars in France Imagens Historiarum by Ralph of Daistow. Translated excerpts relating to Richard's wars with Philip II Part 6. Death of a king in March 1199. Richard was campaigning in the Limousin, a region in central France where several local lords had rebelled against his authority. Among them was Aymer V, Viscount of Limoges, who owed fealty to Richard as Duke of Aquitaine but had defected to Philip II. The immediate cause of the campaign was a dispute over a treasure reportedly found by a peasant on land belonging to the Viscount. According to Roger of Wendover and other chroniclers, a farmer plowing a field near the castle of Chateau had unearthed a hoard of gold, possibly Roman in origin. The Viscount claimed the treasure, but Richard, as overlord, demanded it be surrendered to him. When the Viscount refused, Richard decided to enforce his rights by besieging the castle. Chateau was not a major fortress. It was a small castle defended by a garrison of perhaps 40 men and of no great strategic importance. For a king of Richard's stature to personally conduct such a minor siege seemed unusual, and some historians have suggested that Richard may have had additional political or personal reasons for the campaign. But contemporary sources indicate Richard took the matter seriously, seeing it as a question of feudal authority that could not be allowed to go unchallenged. The siege began in late March. Richard's forces surrounded the castle and began the standard procedures of medieval siege warfare, including bombardment with stone-throwing engines and attempts to undermine the walls. The garrison, vastly outnumbered and with no hope of relief, continued to resist, perhaps hoping for terms of surrender or simply following their lord's orders to delay the inevitable. On the evening of March 26, 1199, Richard was inspecting the siege works, reportedly without full armor. Some sources claim he was wearing only a helmet and was carrying a shield but no mail protection for his body, though this detail is disputed. A single defender on the castle walls, later identified in some sources as a crossbowman named Bertrand de Gourdon, shot a crossbow bolt at the king. The bolt struck Richard in the left shoulder, near the neck. In different circumstances, this might have been a survivable wound, but several factors made it fatal. Richard apparently attempted to remove the bolt himself and bungled the extraction, breaking off the shaft and leaving the head embedded in the wound. A surgeon was summoned to remove it, but in doing so caused significant additional trauma, tearing the surrounding tissue. The wound became infected. In an age before antibiotics or proper understanding of sterilization, infected wounds frequently led to gangrene and death. For nearly 2 weeks, Richard's condition deteriorated. He remained lucid for much of this time, giving orders and making arrangements for the succession. According to several chroniclers, including Roger of Howden, Richard summoned his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who made the difficult journey to be at her son's bedside. He also sent for his brother John and various nobles and bishops. He dictated his will, dividing his treasures and possessions and specifying where his body should be buried. One of the most famous stories from Richard's final days involves the crossbowman who shot him. According to several sources, including Roger of Wendover, the castle fell shortly after Richard was wounded, and Bertrand de Gourdon was captured and brought before the dying king. Richard asked why he had killed him. Bertrand supposedly replied that Richard had killed his father and brothers, and he sought revenge. Impressed by this answer, Richard ordered that the man be released and given money. However, after Richard's death, one of Richard's captains, Mercadier, had Bertrand flayed alive and hanged. This story has all the elements of medieval legend, and some historians question whether it happened as described, but it appears in multiple independent sources and may have a basis in fact. Richard died on April 6, 1199, at the age of 41. He had reigned for 9 years and 9 months. According to his wishes, his body was treated in the medieval fashion reserved for royalty and great nobles whose burial sites were distant from their place of death. His corpse was eviscerated, and his internal organs were buried separately. His heart was placed in a casket and buried at Rouen Cathedral in Normandy. His entrails were buried at the chapel at Chalice where he died. His body was embalmed and transported to Fontevraud Abbey in Anjou, where he was buried at the feet of his father, Henry II. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who would outlive Richard by 5 years, would also be buried there, and their effigies can still be seen in the abbey today. The news of Richard's death sent shockwaves across Europe. In England, the succession passed to his brother John, despite some support for Arthur of Brittany, the son of Richard's deceased brother Geoffrey. John would prove to be one of the most unsuccessful kings in English history, losing most of the French territories Richard had fought to defend, and ultimately being forced to sign Magna Carta in 1215. Philip II of France immediately seized the opportunity presented by Richard's death, launching campaigns that would ultimately strip the Angevin Empire of Normandy, Anjou, and most of its other French territories. Contemporary reactions to Richard's death varied. In England, where Richard had spent so little time and which he had taxed so heavily, the response was muted. William of Newburgh wrote that Richard had been a bad king to England, extracting wealth but providing little governance. In France, particularly in Aquitaine and Normandy, the loss was felt more deeply, as Richard had been an active and engaged ruler of those territories. Among crusading circles and the military aristocracy of Europe, Richard's death was seen as the loss of a great warrior and the foremost military commander of his generation. Muslim sources also noted Richard's death with respect. While he had been an enemy of Islam and responsible for the deaths of thousands of Muslims, writers such as Ibn al-Athir acknowledged his courage and military skill. Saladin himself had died in 1193, just months after Richard's departure from the Holy Land, and the 2 men who had defined the Third Crusade did not live to see the final collapse of the Crusader presence in the region, which would come a century later. The manner of Richard's death, killed by a crossbow bolt during a minor siege, seemed almost anticlimactic for a king who had survived major battles, sieges, shipwrecks, and captivity. Some chroniclers saw divine judgment in his death, punishment for his sins, which according to medieval moralists included pride, violence, and sexual immorality. Others saw tragic irony in a great warrior being brought down not in glorious battle, but by a random shot from an unknown defender of an insignificant castle. Modern historians have debated what Richard might have achieved had he lived longer. By 1199, he had recovered most of the territories lost during his captivity, and had established a strong defensive position against Philip II. Château Gaillard stood as a seemingly impregnable barrier to French invasion of Normandy. Richard's military reputation was at its peak, and his finances, though strained, were adequate to continue the war. It is plausible that Richard could have maintained the Angevin Empire and possibly even expanded it. His early death removed the one figure capable of matching Philip II militarily, and allowed the French king to systematically dismantle the Plantagenet holdings in France over the following decades. Richard left no legitimate children, though he acknowledged at least one illegitimate son, Philip of Cognac. His marriage to Berengaria of Navarre had produced no heirs, and the couple spent very little time together during their marriage. This has led to centuries of speculation about Richard's sexuality, with some historians suggesting he may have been homosexual or bisexual. The evidence is ambiguous and has been interpreted in conflicting ways. Contemporary sources mention that Richard did penance on several occasions for unspecified sexual sins, but whether these referred to heterosexual or homosexual activity, or simply to adultery, remains unclear. John Gillingham and other scholars have argued that the question cannot be definitively answered from the available evidence, and that medieval categories of sexuality differ significantly from modern ones, making direct comparisons problematic. What is undeniable is that Richard's death at Challis Jabral ended one of the most extraordinary reigns in medieval history. A king who spent fewer than 6 months in England during a 10-year reign. A warrior who won every major battle he fought. A crusader who became the most famous Christian commander of the age without recapturing Jerusalem. A ruler who extracted enormous wealth from his kingdoms to fund constant warfare. A man whose legend would grow to overshadow the historical reality. With his death, the age of Richard the Lionheart came to an end, but the legend of Richard the Lionheart was only beginning. Sources used: Richard I by John Gillingham, pages 313–331, The Reign of Richard Lionheart by Ralph V. Turner, pages 188–214, Chronica by Roger of Howden, translated excerpts relating to Richard's death, Florus Historiarum by Roger of Wendover, translated excerpts relating to the Siege of Challis and Richard's death, Historia Rerum Anglicarum by William of Newburgh, translated excerpts relating to reactions to Richard's death, Richard Coeur de Lion by Jean Flory, pages 401–428, Part 7, Legend, Legacy, and Historical Reality. Within years of his death, Richard I of England began his transformation from historical king to legendary hero. The process was driven by multiple factors: his dramatic life story, his military achievements, his participation in the Crusades, and the failures of his successors, which made his reign seem golden by comparison. Chronicles written during and immediately after his lifetime emphasized his courage, his prowess in battle, and his devotion to the crusading cause. Later writers embellished these accounts, adding legendary elements that gradually obscured the historical Richard beneath layers of myth and romance. The military reputation was built on solid foundation. Richard was genuinely one of the most accomplished commanders of his era. His victories at Arsuf, Jaffa, and numerous sieges demonstrated tactical skill, strategic thinking, and personal bravery. He understood siege warfare at a technical level unusual for medieval monarchs, involving himself in the details of engineering, artillery placement, and fortification design. He mastered logistics, the often overlooked key to medieval military success, ensuring his armies were supplied and his campaigns properly resourced. He combined aggressive tactics with careful planning, and he possessed the physical courage to lead from the front, inspiring his troops through personal example. Yet military skill does not automatically translate into successful kingship, and here the assessment of Richard becomes more complex. Modern historians, particularly since the mid-20th century, have increasingly questioned whether Richard's military achievements justified the costs they imposed on his kingdoms. John Gillingham, the leading modern biographer of Richard, presents a generally positive assessment, arguing that Richard was an effective ruler of his continental domains, and that his military campaigns were necessary to defend the Angevin Empire against French aggression. Ralph Turner, another prominent Richard scholar, offers a more critical view, emphasizing Richard's neglect of England and the enormous financial burden his wars placed on his subjects. England experienced Richard primarily through taxation. The Saladin tithe, the ransom, the tallages and levies to fund the wars in France, these extractions drained the kingdom's wealth. Richard sold offices, privileges, and exemptions to raise cash. He treated England as a revenue source rather than a kingdom to be governed. William of Newburgh, writing within a few years of Richard's death, stated bluntly that Richard was a bad king who cared nothing for England except for the money he could extract from it. This assessment, coming from a contemporary chronicler, carries significant weight. Against this must be balanced the fact that Richard appointed competent administrators who governed England effectively in his absence. Hubert Walter, serving as Archbishop of Canterbury and Justiciar, maintained order, reformed the justice system, and collected revenue efficiently. England did not descend into chaos during Richard's absences, which suggests that the administrative machinery functioned adequately. Some historians argue that Richard's hands-off approach, while neglectful by modern standards, was actually reasonable for a medieval king ruling multiple territories, and that the real problem was not Richard's absence but the unrealistic expectation that he should prioritize England over his other domains. Richard's crusading legacy is equally complicated. He did not recapture Jerusalem, the stated goal of the Third Crusade. He spent only 16 months in the Holy Land, a relatively brief period for such an ambitious undertaking. He massacred the prisoners at Acre, an act that horrified Muslim observers and troubled some Christians. He quarreled with fellow Crusaders, particularly King Philip II and Duke Leopold of Austria, undermining Crusader unity. He negotiated with Saladin while simultaneously fighting him, engaging in diplomatic maneuvering that some viewed as pragmatic and others saw as inconsistent with crusading ideals. Yet Richard's crusading achievements were substantial. He captured Cyprus, providing a crucial base for future crusading efforts. He broke the siege of Acre, which had stalemated for nearly 2 years before his arrival. He won the Battle of Arsuf, demonstrating that Saladin's forces could be defeated in open battle. He refortified the coastal cities, securing a Christian presence in the Holy Land that would last another century. The Treaty of Jaffa, while falling short of recapturing Jerusalem, guaranteed Christian access to the holy sites and stabilized the military situation. Given the resources available and the strength of Saladin's position, Richard achieved arguably as much as was realistically possible. Christopher Tyerman, in his comprehensive history of the Crusades, argues that Richard was the most effective military commander to participate in any of the major crusades, and that his tactical and strategic abilities were unmatched among crusading leaders. Thomas Bridge similarly emphasizes Richard's military accomplishments while acknowledging his limitations as a diplomat and politician. These scholarly assessments recognize Richard as a formidable warrior and capable general, while maintaining a realistic view of what he actually achieved. The legend of Richard the Lionheart diverged increasingly from historical reality in the centuries following his death. Medieval romances transformed him into an ideal Christian knight, brave, generous, and devoted to chivalry. The epithet Lionheart, which may have been used occasionally during his lifetime but was not his primary designation, became permanently attached to his name, symbolizing courage and martial prowess. Stories circulated of Richard's strength, his ability to fight multiple opponents simultaneously, and his noble character. Some of these stories had basis in fact. Richard was genuinely physically imposing and personally brave, but they were exaggerated and mythologized beyond recognition. The association of Richard with the Robin Hood legends represents one of the most significant distortions of his historical legacy. The Robin Hood stories, which developed gradually over several centuries, eventually incorporated Richard as the good king whose return from the Crusade would restore justice to England after the tyranny of Prince John and the Sheriff of Nottingham. This narrative became fixed in popular culture, through 19th and 20th century literature and film. It presents Richard as a king who cared deeply about England and its people, who would punish corrupt officials and reward the faithful upon his return. This portrayal is almost entirely fictional. The historical Richard spent minimal time in England, cared little about English affairs except as they related to revenue, and showed no particular interest in justice for common people. The romanticized Richard of the Robin Hood legends bears almost no resemblance to the historical king. Yet the legend proved far more powerful than historical fact, and for many people, particularly in England and the English-speaking world, Richard the Lionheart remains synonymous with idealized medieval kingship. Richard's reputation in France developed differently. In the regions he actually ruled, Aquitaine, Normandy, Anjou, he was remembered more accurately as a warrior duke and king who defended his territories against French aggression. But in areas loyal to the French crown, Richard was sometimes portrayed as a brutal invader and an enemy of France. These conflicting French memories of Richard reflect the complex political geography of the Angevin Empire and the ambiguity of Richard's position as both a French duke and an English king. In the Muslim world, Richard became a figure of legend as well, though of a different kind. Arabic sources from the Crusading period, including the accounts of Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad and Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, portray Richard as a formidable and dangerous enemy, but also acknowledge his courage and, at times, his honorable conduct. Later Islamic historiography sometimes paired Richard and Saladin as exemplars of medieval chivalry, despite being on opposite sides of the conflict. This tradition, which emphasizes mutual respect between noble opponents, reflects medieval ideals but also simplifies a more complex and often brutal military struggle. Modern historians of the Crusades have worked to separate the legendary Richard from the historical figure. Amin Maalouf, in his influential work examining the Crusades from Arab perspectives, presents Richard as a skilled but ruthless commander whose actions, particularly the Acre massacre, left deep scars in Muslim historical memory. Western historians have increasingly adopted more balanced assessments, recognizing Richard's genuine military talents while acknowledging his failures as an administrator and the questionable morality of some of his actions. The legacy of Richard I extends beyond his personal reputation to his impact on medieval culture and institutions. The concept of chivalry, which was developing during Richard's lifetime, became closely associated with his legend. The idea of the warrior king who personally led his troops into battle, who valued courage and martial skill above all, and who embodied the ideals of knighthood. This template, whether or not it accurately described the historical Richard, influenced how later medieval rulers understood their roles. Kings from Edward I of England to Louis IX of France modeled aspects of their public personas on crusading warrior kings like Richard. Richard's architectural legacy survives in stone. Château Gaillard, though partially demolished, still stands overlooking the Seine, a testament to medieval military engineering and Richard's understanding of fortification. The castles he built, rebuilt, or improved across Normandy and Aquitaine shaped the landscape and influenced the development of military architecture for generations. His patronage, though less extensive than some medieval monarchs, contributed to the cultural flowering of the late 12th century. Perhaps most significantly, Richard's reign and the costs it imposed contributed to political developments that would reshape English governance. The enormous financial demands of Richard's crusade and wars necessitated increasingly sophisticated systems of taxation and revenue collection. The administrative apparatus developed to govern England in Richard's absence established precedents for bureaucratic government. The resentment generated by Richard's demands for money, combined with the even more aggressive taxation under King John, created conditions that led to Magna Carta in 1215 and the gradual development of parliamentary institutions. In this indirect way, Richard's absentee kingship, and his constant need for funds contributed to the evolution of constitutional government in England. Modern assessments of Richard the Lionheart vary depending on which aspects of his reign scholars emphasize. Military historians generally rate him highly, placing him among the most capable commanders of the medieval period. Historians of the Crusades acknowledge his achievements while noting his failure to recapture Jerusalem. Historians of England often criticize his neglect of the kingdom and his exploitative financial policies. Historians of France and the Angevin Empire debate whether his wars against Philip II were defensive necessities or aggressive campaigns that ultimately weakened the Plantagenet position. What remains undisputed is that Richard was a complex figure who cannot be reduced to simple categories of good or bad king. He was a brilliant military commander whose tactical and strategic skills were exceptional. He was a neglectful ruler of England who treated the kingdom primarily as a source of revenue. He was a devoted crusader who spent enormous resources attempting to reclaim the Holy Land, but ultimately failed to achieve that goal. He was capable of both chivalrous gestures and shocking brutality. He was a man of his time, shaped by the values of the 12th century warrior aristocracy, judged by contemporary standards that differed greatly from modern ones. The historical Richard I, the third son who inherited an empire, the warrior who never lost a major battle, the crusader who fought Saladin to a standstill, the king who spent his life defending French territories and died besieging a minor castle over a disputed treasure. This figure is remarkable enough without the embellishments of legend. His reign lasted less than 10 years, but its impact on medieval Europe, on the Crusades, and on the development of the English monarchy was profound and lasting. The legendary Richard the Lionheart, the noble Crusader king, the hero of chivalric romance, the good king of the Robin Hood stories, continues to shape popular understanding of the Middle Ages. This Richard, created by centuries of storytelling, literature, and film, serves purposes that have nothing to do with historical accuracy. He represents idealized kingship, romantic adventure, and a simplified vision of medieval life that never existed. Both versions of Richard, the historical and the legendary, remain part of our cultural inheritance. The challenge for modern understanding is to appreciate the legend while recognizing the reality. That Richard I of England was a medieval king of extraordinary military talent and remarkable personal courage, whose reign was marked by near-constant warfare, whose relationship with England was distant and exploitative, whose crusading achievements were significant but incomplete, and whose early death ended one of the most dramatic lives in medieval history. He was neither the perfect Christian knight of legend, nor the simple villain some modern revisionists have portrayed, but rather a complex, driven, and profoundly medieval figure whose true story is more interesting than any myth. Sources used: Richard I by John Gillingham, pages 330–357, The Reign of Richard Lionheart by Ralph V. Turner, pages 215–254, Richard Coeur de Lion by Jean Flory, pages 429–478, The Crusades Through Arab Eyes by Amin Maalouf, pages 228–240, One God's War. A New History of the Crusades by Christopher Tyerman, pages 430–467, The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, entry on Richard I Chronica Majora by Matthew Paris, selections relating to the development of Richard's legend in the 13th century medieval writers and the Robin Hood legend, various scholarly articles in the Oxford Illustrated History of the Crusades.